Welcome to the Queen of Vintage Sew Through the Century. I'm going through my vintage patterns and sewing one outfit from each decade from the 1910s until today. Our first installment of Sew Through the Century is going to be my oldest sewing pattern, which is from 1915. This Edwardian era skirt with suspenders is a pictorial review pattern number 6204. And the accompanying blouse is from Wearing History. It's the Restovival Elsie, also known as number R113. These are my thoughts so far. The pictorial review pattern is sized for a 26-inch waist, and I haven't seen a 26-inch waist since I was around 12, so I had to grade it up significantly in the waist area. For all of you who swear by a mock-up or muslin of a garment, I use a technique from the 1940s called a paper fitting, rather than making a test run out of actual fabric. Since I use medical tissue paper, it's thin enough that it can resemble pretty much any fabric with some structure, such as what I'm using for this outfit. While I had to grade up the waist measurement of the skirt, I had to cut 6 inches from the length. I had no idea that Edwardian era women type people were so tall. The pattern allows a 42-inch length for a regulation length skirt, whatever that is, and my skirt is 36 inches long, allowing for the hem, and I'm just barely 5 feet 2, so make of that what you will. I'm making this skirt out of some mid-weight gray twill, which is close enough to the weight of a skirt that it should be okay. Don't at me, all you super historical clothing peeps. I'm not a historian, and I'm not going for era authenticity. I'm just sewing patterns and fabric from my collection. For the Elsie blouse, I went with something a bit more fantastical because it's my project, and this project is just a teeny bit Wibbly Wobbly Timey Wimey. Since I didn't have nearly enough fabric to make the full blouse, I went with contrasting collar and sleeves in the gray of the skirt fabric. Looking at the instructions for the skirt, this is going to be an interesting make. Part of the instructions are missing because the envelope has missing bits, and like all patterns from the early parts of last century, they do assume you have certain knowledge, so I had to study the cutting layout and make educated guesses about how the skirt closes. I'm guessing hooks and eyes, probably? For the buttons on the skirt, I'm using vintage silver buttons from my Nana's button jar. For the blouse, I found one button in the jar that would have worked, but I need significantly more buttons than that, so I ordered them online last night really late from Joann's for curbside pickup today, and I hope they don't cancel my order since I ordered late at night. I did not film me drafting or cutting out all the pieces because my studio is really small and trying to film me cutting larger pieces would have been an exercise in futility. Plus, it was dark and late at night, so there wouldn't have been much to see anyway. But you can enjoy footage of me cutting some of the smaller ones. Fast forward to this afternoon, and good news! My button order from Joann's did not get canceled. I guess nobody wants buttons when they're all trying to make masks. So there's that. Now that I've got all my supplies in hand and the pieces are cut, I'm going to get to work actually constructing the garment. Wish me luck! Okay, so before I actually do my old vintage pattern from 1915, I have to make a blouse to go with it, and I chose the Elsie blouse from Wearing History. It's a Restovival pattern, and here I'm putting the facings on the front of the blouse, and then I'm going to put the fronts onto the back. Now, Restovival patterns are old patterns that are basically reprinted, and they have the same instructions of the original pattern. There's been no changes made to them other than grading them for multiple sizes. Next up, we're going to put the collar pieces together and sew them, and then flip it right side out, and then we'll press it. And I am pressing everything as I go. I just am not showing that here because this video would not be 9 minutes long. It would be 109 minutes long. Now you see me finishing off the raw edges on all of the parts of the blouse before I do the side seams. And here I am putting the collar onto the blouse, making sure that once it's all attached, it's going to be underneath those facings. So when the facings are flipped to the inside, it's going to be super nice and neat. Now it is time to actually try on the blouse and see how it fits. And so far, it looks like it fits pretty good. Got everything kind of going where it needs to go, checking out the facings. Now we're going to do up the side seams and then top stitch all the way around the collar and the edges so that it's nice and neat. The next step here, I'm doing the inside of the collar and turning that raw edge under so that it's nice and pretty from both sides. There's a waist stay for the inside of this blouse, and you can do it with a drawstring or an elastic, but I just chose to gather it all up and stitch it down so that it looked real pretty. And I'm using a turquoise thread that kind of matches the chest pieces of these Cybermen. And I totally should have hemmed this before I put the stay on, and that's totally my bad, because I'm doing this really narrow hem and it's kind of a pain in the tushy, but I am using a zigzag stitch to make it a little bit easier, because gathered up fabric is a whole lot harder to hem than flat fabric. Here is the mostly finished blouse with the top stitching. You can see the Cyberman pattern really well, and the buttons, of course, are the turquoise ones, and they're not on here yet, but they will be. I did not film that process because hand sewing takes me forever, and I did not want this video to be super long. Here we go with the skirt. I'm prepping everything, turning all the edges under on the small bits, and then top stitching those down so that it's a whole lot easier to do putting the skirt together. I really had a rough time with this, even though it's a relatively simple number of pieces. The directions were not really intuitive. So I went with the suspenders and the pointed waist thing. It's not actually the waistband, it's just a kind of a decorative thing. And I did narrow hems on all those pieces because the instructions were rather limited. And you can see that I have 2 pin cups. One is for flat-headed pins and one is for round-headed pins. So I'm just top stitching that bit, and then I'm doing up all of the straight seams on the inside, which have a 1-inch seam allowance, which is actually kind of nice. I'm used to sewing with a 1/2 inch or 5/8 inch seam allowance, and this pattern gave a 1-inch seam allowance allowed. All in all, I think this went together pretty quickly. I did have to hand sew the buttons on to the suspender bits, and I had to hand sew 3 bars and hooks for closures on the back side. And again, I did not film any of the hand sewing because we would have been here for 20 years. I'm pinning together everything here so that I can just stitch everything all at once. The waistband, they call it a stay, and it's basically a waistband, but just with a different name. And I'm sandwiching that in between the suspendery bit and the skirt so that on the inside, you know, I'll have a nice waistband. I didn't use any interfacing or anything. It didn't say to. And that's what I was checking the pattern instructions for, was to just see what they were saying about how to do the waistband. And we're going to do this really slow pan all the way to the bottom of the bottom edge. It's very long. I'm also very short, so I ended up cutting probably 6 inches off the bottom of this before I turned up the hem. It's still pinned together here. You don't see all the buttons sewn on and you don't see the hooks sewn on, but it actually fits really well. I was really happy with it. This fabric is a little clingy, a lot clingy actually. I would probably wear a petticoat with it if I were probably to wear it again. Not pregnant, just fat. It hits me in a very awkward place. You can see the buttons on the suspender bits, front and back. And there you go. Final thoughts on this one. All in all, was not a horrible project. So tell me what you think in the comments. And next up is the 1920s, where I will be working on a variation on the theme of the 1-hour dress.